my god!
Quite the effortless transition.
That was beautiful. I hit record right before you peaked the mic.
Oh, that
Wonderful.
sounds so wrong.
Oh yeah. All right. Okay. All right. I'm gonna get into it now. God damn it. Okay. Welcome. We're getting into linear and adaptive music today, as you could guess, and as you've seen, because I've been shoving it down everyone's throats for like a few days. Yeah, welcome back. It's the second last session of the semester. The next one is, I forget if it's next week or the week after that, but it's not really a big session. It's more just a workshop thing where you can live stream, show everyone and show us what you've been doing, if you've been doing. And yeah, it's good for, I don't know, figured it would be nice to get feedback in that area and just kind of, let everyone coagulate and help each other because it's a community. All right. I hope you're ready. This one's gonna be the magnum opus right here, so make sure you got like food and water to last a few days. Buckle up. It's gonna be a good one. So what's happening today? We're gonna be covering both types of music found in games. That's the titular linear and adaptive music, as you might have guessed. And we're going to be going into a lot of detail about different methods and applications for their use, and of course some examples along the way, and maybe even a couple pictures, because we haven't actually thrown in any pictures until last week, which is kind of insane. Alright, so where do you even start with this kind of thing? Because it's a pretty daunting thing to think about, just music that's always playing, always changing, and always just reacting to what the player does, and how to use linear and adaptive pieces together to form a cohesive whole in the game. So you should have a vision of what you kind of want and how it would work with your game. Like we've been saying at every single session, basically. Just know what your game is, find the style, and then from there, think about how it would apply. Like if it's an FPS, maybe then at every checkpoint you can have a ticker go up, and that'll add another layer or two. Or when you enter combat, the game state will reflect that, and then through that it can change the piece into an action heavy piece. Or you can just have something simple like in Skyrim, how when you enter combat the ambient music just kind of drops off, and then the combat music we've all heard a billion times appears. Or something more complex like how Doom has the music parallel to the battle, where every single glory kill and every single like hit you take is reflected in the music, and it's changing and adapting on the fly. So both require writing musical pieces. One of them just needs ridiculous levels of consideration for everything when compared to the other. And once again, you should know what kind of music you want for your game. So this goes into like the kind of styles and what reflects the game's needs best. And for the last point here, make sure you use middleware. Like it's extremely important to be using this. Hello, Tavis. And think of it as a way to craft sound behaviors, which we'll get into in a bit when we get into the dynamic stuff. But before we do that, we're going to be getting into linear stuff. So what is it? It's in the name. It's pretty much every single piece of non-game music there is, and a good chunk of game music. So it's the kind of music that plays from start to finish without any variation at all. And was invented back when Grog smashed a few rocks together. So yeah, pretty much any piece that has a beginning, middle, and end, playing out the exact same every time, that's linear music. And there are three main types that we're going to get into here that can be applied to games, and that's the linear loop, the stinger, and the one-shot. And starting it off, the linear loop, just like linear music, it's exactly what it sounds like. It's a linear piece that loops upon itself. So these are often found as ambient tracks that kind of play in the background, but can also be pretty much any piece of music in the game, from combat music to exploration music to a boss fight, so long as it's a linear piece that loops. So now let's get into actually constructing them and some techniques to employ. So a safe but boring choice with the loops is to actively not include any distinguishable melody. This makes the piece a bit more bland and a bit less memorable, but as a positive, it'll make it a lot more difficult to tell that it's actually looping due to a lack of kind of musical landmarks, which I'm probably going to say landmarks a lot, but when I do, I'm just referring to a part of the music that tends to stick out and be memorable. So the less of those in loops, the better the loop is, as it keeps you immersed, or it keeps the player immersed in the game. And jumping off that last point, continuing to melodically develop the piece over the track's duration will help to provide it with a bit more variability, and it will also avoid repetition of the same phrases over and over again, so it'll help not drive the player insane. And an interesting one is to not always, and in fact I would actually say actively avoid this, but traditional song structure. Everyone knows the general structure of verse, chorus, for most songs, and using that for loops isn't so good, just because the chorus is usually a hook that gets the listener's attention. So when the melody's really good there, it's usually pretty distinguishable. So it's kind of an interesting situation there. So even if it's a fantastic piece, it's a very distinguishable landmark when it's something really good, and it makes it all the more transparent, thus pulling the player out. And you'll notice a lot of these points do have to do with not annoying the player or pulling them out of the game, which is a big thing we have to keep in mind as composers or sound designers. Messing around with the dynamics of a piece can also help bring a bit more flavor to it, offering a bit more variety, even if it's as simple as just gradual increases and decreases in volume. And once again, about repeating figures, if you're going to do it a lot, try to keep it for short loops, so loops that will only play for, say, like a minute or less. And as we've said since the first session, variety is king. So having the same figures loop over and over for a long period of time will just drive the player to want to mute the game. All right, and continuing on to the next slide, because linear loops have a lot to discuss about them. All right, carrying on, we got the slow texture method of composing loops, which kind of relates to a few of the points on the last slide. It entails no prominent melody, and it relies on it being much more of an ambient piece, with chords kind of fading and swelling gently, with really gradual transitions between them. So it's great for building up an atmosphere, and it's also really great for repeating without the player noticing or getting annoyed. And here's a few different ways to make something loop well. Ending the same way as it began. Of all things, Dark Side of the Moon by Pink Floyd is a great example of this, with the initial track Breathe beginning with a heartbeat, and the same heartbeat is at the end of the final track Eclipse. So when listening to it on a loop, it kind of flows seamlessly, while still fitting in nicely with the album's themes. But I could talk about this album for an entire session, but I won't. Point being, the ending being the same as it begins brings with it a nice sense of unity and lets it really flow very smoothly to loop upon itself nicely. Another way of doing this is by making the end and the beginning two halves of the same section. So the first phrase kind of plays out at the end, and it finishes in the second phrase at the beginning of the piece. And funnily enough, Pink Floyd does this as well, this time on The Wall. So starting up the album, you hear the words "We came in," with a really soft melody playing under it before the bombastic and theatrical opening of "In the Flesh." And then at the end of the album, right at the end of "Outside the Wall," it has the same kind of soft melody. And right as it ends, that same voice says, "Is this where?" With the completing loop being, "Is this where we came in?" Once again, being of immense importance to the album's themes and the story. But the point being, having the beginning and the end linked as a single section makes it much more cohesive. And kind of like a branch off of that one, this also connects to the answer question method, which could also be called the response call method, which is a bit of a flip on the phrase often used in jazz improv of call and response, where one player will trade bars with another, often with the first player playing like a distinct melody or phrase, and then the other player or the ensemble play something in response. It's seen in all types of music, so we can use it in game sound or in game music. But you're probably noticing, oh hey, it's the answer and response before the question and the call part of it, and you'd be absolutely right. It's backwards. However, beginning a piece with the answer and then ending it with the question, it it creates a very smooth and logical transition back around to the beginning of the loop. So it starts off with the answer, and you're like, okay, this feels like the end of something, and then it keeps going, and then at the end of the piece, it'll be the call, and then the response will be at the beginning. Looping smoothly. Another jazz improv term, vamp, is when the chord progression is looped, often with the rhythm section doing it. And it's usually to begin the piece to let the melodic players kind of join in with the main melody. So this being applied to loops, and specifically the beginning and the end of the loop, allows it to sort of be a jumping off point for the rest of the piece. And with it being interspersed throughout the piece, helps to avoid it being a clear landmark. And the last one on this list, interrupted progression, is when the first half of a progression ends the piece, with it seamlessly matching the second half that begins the piece. And again, it's kind of similar to the two halves and the answer question methods, but it's kind of distinct in the way that it's just one melody cut in half instead of just two distinct parts or two complementary pieces. And now onto one more slide of loops, and then we're going to be moving on, I swear. All right. So now is addressing some of the issues that arise with loops that make them a bit of a pain. And there are two main ones, and that's reverb tails and the zero crossing point. So reverb tails are the little thing in the bottom right. They're the ends that kind of taper off at the end of the sound. So I included a picture because it's kind of hard for me to verbally describe that. So the issues here with these boys are that they kind of extend too long for a bar, often causing like a weird extra beat or two at the end of a loop, so that when it does loop, the reverb from the previous notes aren't carried over. So what do you do here? One good solution is to trim the loop, the ending of it in particular, and just copy and paste it into a new channel at the beginning. So doing this cleanly avoids any sort of abrupt absence of the reverb, and it allows for a much smoother loop since there isn't really a distinct end with the reverb carrying over back to the beginning. And ending on the same note can kind of help alleviate this issue a bit, making it easier to blend the two seamlessly. And I know this is the case in FL Studio. I'm not sure about other DAWs. But when you're exporting, not only can you do like different, you can split each track individually, but you can go to the wrap option instead of letting the ending trail off or cutting it off. If you let it wrap and select the wrap option, it'll take the reverb for you and it'll put it back at the beginning. So that's really helpful for FL Studio to do that, especially since I know a lot of people in our program use it. So it's pretty helpful. And to cap it off, the zero crossing point is the bottom right, the little dot, or the bottom left, sorry, the little dot there, and is, as you could probably tell by the name, when the audio wave crosses over the 0 point. And if the end is at one place in the spectrum and then it jumps somewhere else upon restarting the loop, it can kind of pull you out, and it can really cause a lot of clipping, which is very distracting and doesn't sound good. So to alleviate this, we need to get the beginning and the end of the piece as close to as possible to the 0 point. And obviously this applies to both mono and stereo, so that's something to keep an eye on if you're mixing a stereo piece. So a relatively harmless way to do this, to bring it closer to 0, is to have insanely short fade in, fade outs, right at those spots to bring it closer to 0. And even if it's like 0.01 seconds of a fade in at the beginning and a fade out at the end, it'll still bring it closer to 0 to avoid a bit of that clipping and popping. And as you can guess, with all these issues, more ambient tracks with a lot of reverb are a lot more difficult than rhythmic tracks. But they're still very doable. They're still very workable. And yeah, applying these techniques to ambient tracks can help ease the pain a bit. Now, with linear loops out of the way, let's blow through the other two types of linear music and get to the adaptive fun stuff. So, the stinger. A stinger is a short piece of music or a melody that kind of alerts the player to something. And it's basically used a lot for feedback or to punctuate something. And this is reflected in games. So these things can range from like beating a level or dying, or having a checkpoint, or a horror game, like Anthony just said in the chat. Like a jump scare comes up and boom, stinger. Or if you're playing Amnesia and you see someone walking in the distance and those violins come in, that would be the stinger. So it could be used in a ton of different ways. And so there's a few ways to kind of implement it. One of the main ways is it should be complementary to the main track to avoid any kind of dissonance, unless you're doing a horror game, where the dissonance is really kind of key to making you uncomfortable. But if it's used throughout the game over a variety of different pieces, it could benefit from being reflective of the entire score to just kind of work anywhere. Transitional stingers, string together tracks, preparing the listener for the key and the tempo of the track that it leads into. So let's say you're playing the exploration track one moment, and then, oh no, combat begins. So it plays the transitional stinger, and then boom, combat music, that kind of thing. And tying into both of those points, if a track is used in many different ways, or places accompanying different pieces, it's often really helpful to make it a bit more atonal. Like percussion is really helpful for that, or like a big cymbal crash. And doing this, once again, avoids any sort of weird dissonances that can happen in the music. And for an example of a game that uses stingers quite unlike any others, like Daniel said in the chat, is the Mario games. So collecting coins plays them, hitting 100 coins and getting a 1-up plays one, and then when you beat the level, it does that that thing. But it makes you feel super proud, and it is distinct in that when you hear that piece, you think, okay, I just beat a level. And that's a very good use for a stinger, as it's very distinct and very much gives off the emotions of like pride and accomplishment that you would expect from beating a level. All right, and moving on to the last piece of linear music is the one-shot track, which is a piece that plays once and doesn't loop. So it encompasses most music as well as film and TV scores. And there's a few primary uses of these in games, namely the following. The in-game one-shot is something that's triggering gameplay but doesn't loop. So the tricky thing here is that they might not be beginning at the right time or ending at the right time. So they're a bit risky to be used in common gameplay. However, a fantastic example of this is in Red Dead Redemption, which if you've played it, you probably know exactly what I'm talking about when you first ride into Mexico. Yeah, Hamraj knows. But yeah, when you ride into Mexico, without spoiling anything, a lot's happened in the story so far. And you're treated to a beautiful Jose Gonzalez piece that just fits the tone flawlessly. And it just makes it such an incredible and memorable moment, despite the gameplay just being riding your horse around the hills of Mexico. But even, like, I haven't played that game in half a decade at this point, but it still sticks out in my mind as one of the most memorable parts of the game to me. So one shots are very important. They're very helpful in kind of solidifying a moment in the game in somebody's mind. Yeah, they're really good for that. And in kind of a similar note, cinematics and cutscenes, they're tailored to in the same way that films and TV are, with a score set to it in a very structured way. And the beauty here is that everything plays out in sequence in a set timetable. So it's great for those that like everything structured or would like to make, just normal out-of-game music or score film or TV or that kind of thing. So it's really helpful for those people, and it's really good to kind of get a grasp of what you're doing for that piece. An example of this, it's this but backwards in a way, is in Doom 2016, where after going into the elevator up to the Mars surface right at the beginning, the title sequence is playing out with At Doom's Gate playing. And all of that is while it's loading the level and playing a cinematic that ends with the Slayer cocking the shotgun in time with the music. So that's a really memorable part of the game. But the music was already made before the cutscene. So they had to kind of structure the cutscene around the piece. So if you ever get that kind of get that much freedom to build the piece, and then the designers have to build the cutscene and cinematic around the piece, that could be a great way of implementing it. But as one would expect with seriously varied hardware between the consoles and PC, this was incredibly difficult to pull off. So the application is just kind of interesting as it's structuring the cinematic around the music. But it's a great case, and it's really cool. And finally, scripted events. These are the parts when COD puts you on rails to commit several war crimes in a matter of seconds, or when Uncharted very ungently pushes you down the path that they really want you to go down, because we swear there's a good story thing here. So they're kind of like in-game one-shots, but they're much closer to cutscenes in that they're a lot more theatrical and planned out. They're often for quick time events as well. And they're much... I already said that part. But it like being similar to cutscenes in that they're theatrical and very planned sequences. It allows for film scoring techniques to be applied in the gameplay context. So it's pretty interesting there. All right, and with all that aside, what's its place in games? A better question is what isn't its place, because it is incredibly versatile. it can be used in everything from marketing and promotional materials to the menus, the minute-to-minute gameplay, cutscenes, QuickTime events, pretty much every facet of a game. So it's incredibly versatile for being linear, and when used right, it can honestly be all you need in a game, saving yourself a ton of work. And just to top this section off, in case the obscenely long section about loops didn't clue you in, loops are incredibly important and will be, without a doubt, used in one form or another throughout your games. Alright, and now getting into the fun stuff. So, obligatory prequel meme there. And time to get into adaptive music. So, what is it? Put simply, it's music that changes as you play the game. Oh, that's great Anakin meme there. But yeah, it's music that changes as you play the game, reacting to triggers and game states, and it's used in pretty much every modern game. With my go-to examples, as always, being Halo and Doom, but once again Mario Kart, for similar to the last one, and most RPGs have it as well. And of all things, Frogger actually was one of the first games to kind of change the music as you play. LucasArts also kind of started this back in the 90s with software called iMuse, which was used in Monkey Island 2. But even before that, back in the 18th century, back in them video games, it started back with musical dice games. So how these would work is you'd be at like a pub or something with the boys, and there'd be a band. I said boys like I'm from Newfoundland. Yeah, you'd be in the pub with the boys, and there'd be music playing, and you would have dice. So each throw of the dice would determine the next measure of the piece. So every time a piece would play, it would play out differently. So one time you can get like maybe 5, 8, 10, 14, and then you would play those bars in that order. And then maybe another time you'd get 6, 9, 6, 9, and it would play in that order. Because I'm super mature, I had to throw that in. So each of these measures are written in a way that makes it still musically satisfying, regardless of the combination, when put into practice. And is essentially created as one like large collective piece that all parts of which operate together, but it still allows for different configurations. And music in games, getting back to music in games, because we were already talking about music, said the wrong word, but that's fine. Moving swiftly on, it can react in two main ways, either through direct action or indirect action. So direct action is when the player does something and the music responds. And that would be something like the player activates something or the player punches someone in the face, something like that. And indirect action is when the player's health is low or something, and then the music is reacting to that state. So mixing and matching these is a bit of a process, but in the end has great results and is really important to making it, flow a bit better. And there are two primary ways in which a piece can be made adaptive, and that is through horizontal resequencing and vertical layering. So we'll get into that, and then we'll dive into some other stuff regarding adaptive scores, and then I'll show a few examples, because who doesn't love some examples? All right, starting off with horizontal resequencing. Think of time as a horizontal line, which probably isn't too hard since we've been conditioned towards that for our whole lives, with like timelines, graphs, charts, and math, sheet music, and DAWs. So using this, it's essentially defined as a sequence of a composition being rearranged or played in different orders. So just like that, musical dice is a very low-tech example of it, just kind of taking measures and rearranging them as you go to create a unique piece. So, like I said with the musical dice example in the last slide, each piece is written in chunks or segments, and these can range from a few notes to several whole measures. And from there, each segment can then have markers where the engine can switch from one part to another, which I'll explain in a bit more detail when we get to examples at the end. And it's a bit of a task and can involve ridiculous amounts of files for one song and a ridiculous amount of markers to keep it kind of dynamic. But the work definitely pays off in that it results in a very strong effect and a very strong result. And with the piece constantly switching, you'll want it to blend pretty nicely. So there's a couple ways to go about this. With the two main ones being fades, which is a boring but safe way to do it. Or you could go the Alpha Chad direction and build a transitional piece with the sole purpose of just blending between two pieces to give it a bit of a natural transition. And some advantages of this approach include incredible dynamicy and reactivity, keeping kind of in flow with the gameplay at all times. And it can really make the player feel like, oh, the music is like being scored live. Like when you play Doom, when you're playing it, you feel like, yeah, the music feels it. The music feels what I'm doing. But a few of the big disadvantages, you can often be limited to a set chord structure. Oh yeah, you can guess which one I do. But yeah, they're often limited to a set chord structure. Matt is absolutely right. And tempo per segment pretty often, which makes transitions a bit janky. And the often short duration of these pieces and segments can make it a bit difficult to include any sort of themes, and kind of can lead them to being kind of musically simplistic, which is a little tough, but you can work around it if you think hard enough about it, or just put in time. And the other half of it, vertical layering. So this is the other half of the coin. It takes a piece, and it's when a piece has several layers to it. So in music, verticality is often associated with chords and other instrument parts that are occurring at the same time. So vertical layering, it's no different, with the only difference being the ability to add and remove layers at will. Something's kind of similar to it is stem mixing, which stems being the instrument parts in a DAW. So there's like the piano stem, the guitar stems, the string stems, brass, etc. So stem mixing usually ends with all the stems being played together in unison to create the final piece. Whereas in vertical layering, there's often a lot of different configurations to give the stems different vibes in different orders. So the next few slides are going to discuss these points in a bit more detail, and don't worry, it's not as crazy as the linear loop slides. It's just spread out to give each topic a bit of room. And so the first one is additive and interchange techniques. So the additive technique is when all the layers are mixed to each other, blending properly when they're all played at the same time, so that if they're all played at the same volume, it's still musically satisfying. And with this method, more layers are added in over time to have a bit more variety. So that would be the case with stem mixing pretty often. But instead of stem mixing, you probably won't have every single part play at the same time unless it's like the big climactic moment. But it's still good to mix everything to each other and keep it so that if it all plays at the same time, it's still cohesive and still understandable. And contrasting that, the interchange method and approach is when you swap out layers, having written layers with the express purpose and intent of replacing another rather than adding on to it. So additive, as you could probably guess, is a much more common approach as it gives a lot more options in comparison to interchange. And if you compose all the layers so that they work well, both alone and together, um, it'll obviously afford you the most options and variations in your piece. All right. The vertical layering plan is exactly what it sounds like. It's funny how all of these have names that are very self-explanatory, but I still explain them in detail. But that's fine. Uh, yeah, it's planning out the instrumentation, planning out how you want each layer to sound, and a few useful things here is trying to keep each layer like a small ensemble. That's really helpful as it keeps it a bit more individual while still being a part of the greater whole, leading each layer to be less of just stems of each part and more small arrangements. And I'll kind of get into that a bit more on a later slide. But opportunistic composition comes first. Put plainly, it's composing while thinking about the open areas and the other layers to let something shine through or have a counter melody play. So let's say there's a gap between two melodic lines on layer 1, and then layer 2 it specifically puts a melody there so that it stands out and kind of bridges the gap while still being its own thing in layer 2. So this not only allows for a bit more cohesion in the piece between the layers, but it also offers a new experience upon multiple uses of the layer. So like I just said, if you play layer 1 on its own, there's the gap there. If you play layer 2 on its own, it kind of flows constantly. And then with both of them there, they're both flowing, and then at the gap, the other one really shines through and then accentuates the second half of layer 1. So it can be really helpful for that kind of thing. And in-game behavior. So this section is essentially just thinking about the various ways you'll use the layers and how you'll implement it. Like, when will they come in or out? What sort of transitions will you have between them? Will you do the boring virgin way or the alpha chad way? It's your thing. So that sort of thing. So keeping all of these things in mind will result in a more cohesive musical experience. And also think in detail about the parameters you'll use. So, in an example we'll get into last year, I used very few parameters since mechanically there weren't really a lot of triggers I needed to think about. So there was the in combat parameter, which it was just either 0 or 1, and that would determine which part of the piece was playing. And I'll show that later when we get to the example. But that kind of thing. Just thinking about, okay, when will that in combat trigger be met? Okay, it's when the enemy sees you. Okay, so then you gotta kind of implement it there. And then from there, once you get more mechanically complex, once you get stuff like, okay, you're in combat, but you are winning, or you're in combat, but you're really low on health, and there's a lot of enemies, you're really outnumbered. How are you going to do that? So it really depends on how complex you want to go, but parameters are something you always want to have in mind for implementing the music. And for the last one on vertical layering, tone color. So it's kind of the feel of the tone, so where it lands on the frequency spectrum, whether it's bass, treble, soprano, tenor, that kind of thing. So keeping each of these to their own layers is a good way of differentiating between them, and it keeps them from really blending together. So for example, stick two bass sounds together and it'll get all mushy, whereas if you do a bass and a treble, that'll be a bit more distinct and you can tell which one's which. So you can use this to differentiate or help to differentiate layers. So for example, having all the bass and like lower tones all in the same layer, that way, or when you do that way that when there's another layer that adds on, if that one had a lot of bass stuff in it and it's different from the other bass, then it can cause kind of some conflict there, because especially in the bass and the lower spectrum, that's when, like, if there's two different things and they don't sound, or they don't work together perfectly, it can sound really messy. So it's just something to keep in mind to keep things a bit more clean. And now, what are some applications, which we've got into a bit in the prior slides, but figured we'd have a full-on slide for it. So having the music switch to something more chill, or having an absence of music when the player's done everything to do in an area, that can help to signal the player that they should move on. That's a good way to use dynamic music. Once again, like I said near the beginning, alerting the player to changes of the game state. So boss or enemy health being at a certain point, like in Dark Souls, when you're fighting a boss, usually around the halfway point when it gets to its second phase, that's when the music really kicks up. Like the Nameless King fight is in my mind at all times because of that. But it could also be used for player health, like in Doom when your health gets low and the music is getting harder and faster, kind of pushing you to say, okay, you need to get back into the fight. You need to get out of this, get more health, punch a demon in the face. And like I just said, another way to use it is approaching the end of an encounter. You could switch the music to really chill, kind of ambient vibe, or you could just cut off the music at the end so that they can realize, wait a minute, there's no music. I should probably move on. And you could also use it for feedback for things that the player does. So this could be a use of stingers in your dynamic piece. So whether the player like solves a puzzle or clears all the enemies or beats a level, you can play a stinger, for example, and that'll give feedback to the player of, okay, I did something. And so what do you do? Think about the way sounds play in games. This can really get you to think about how to implement yours properly, and with different ways. Like for me at least, last year I really thought about how Doom did it and how Mick Gordon wrote his music to be used in the game. Obviously I didn't go in that much detail that he did because I'm not a god, but nonetheless, thinking about Doom and how the music was constructed and how it would change as you played, being conscious of that really helped for my composition and really helped for implementing it. And for an example, just an easy way, like when an event happens, play a sound. So player hits space, jump sound plays. Simple as that. Or you can do the Doom example of going insane. You could apply parameters in the engine on events. So the events could be input, they could be collision, whether it's with the ground or with an invisible bounding box that is a checkpoint. It could be something like in the game state, like an enemy count or your health. And it could also be the level completion or even a timer. Like when you're underwater long enough in Sonic, and then the music changes to the most stressful music ever written, I could guarantee you that is a case of this being used. And mix horizontal resequencing and vertical layering. So just doing one of them is good, but doing both can give you a ridiculous amount of options. It can make things really, really nice. And like I said, gives you more options, offers more variety to the listener. And at the end of the day, that's one of the most important things to keep track of. And take things slow. Like I said, don't try to be Mick Gordon the first time around. It takes time to learn these things. And I'm sure he's still learning things about how to do it. So it's always good to learn as much as you can about it. And even if you're just trying new things and you're not sure if it'll work, it's worth a shot. Because at the end of the day, like, we're still in school, we're still learning, and it's really good. It's a really good opportunity to just kind of try things out, and we won't get this opportunity again in the workforce, or like once we're in the industry. So it's really good to have this kind of buffer time of these 4 years. Uh, this is making me sad now. Wow. Um, anyways, showing all right, showing some of this off now in FMOD. So I'm gonna do something that's unheard of. I'm gonna switch the window and hope that everything doesn't fall apart. All right. And OBS. Yay. Okay. Everyone can see this, right?
Yep, you're good.
Yay. Cool. All right. So this is some behind the scenes look. I hope my team doesn't want to lynch me for this, but especially Anthony when he sees what I'm about to do. But
I don't care.
all right,
Go
cool. So there's a lot of really neat things in FMOD when it comes to both linear and adaptive music, but also sound design. And since I didn't really touch on that in the presentation, or at least I didn't directly touch on that, I wanted to kind of touch on it here since this is a good example of just vertical layering being used for voice lines or sounds in this case. So as you can tell, this is one track, but you're probably thinking, wow, it's empty. It's not. It's just there's a lot of audio files in here. So this is
Can't wait for this to be on the internet.
oh yeah, it's gonna be great. So basically, what we did for the game is each of the characters has different voice lines that play in different scenarios. So this is the seeing enemy one, which plays when, obviously, it's in the name, you see an enemy. And as you can guess, having the same line, like, there's an enemy ahead, that, like, something like that, play every single time you see an enemy, that would get really old. So one way to do this, to make it a bit more adaptive, as one might say, you turn probability on here and then set the chance to lower. So every time you see an enemy, it checks, it runs the chance, or it runs through this, and if the probability is good, then it'll play it. So that's one way to offer it a bit more variability. But the big way, as you can see here, is that there's like almost 30 voice lines, each of which have a different percentage of playing here, which is fairly simple. All you need to do is double click this and do set play percentage, which basically just does that but for individual lines. And when you hit shuffle, that way,
eyes on.
I love this. That way every time you
Shoot
play
'em.
it'll play a different line,
Light him up.
and like we just saw there, sometimes it doesn't play. So this is a good use of vertical layering with a bit of, oh, that's Anthony, just so you know.
Yeah, that's why I said I can't wait for this to be all over the internet.
Poor guy. But yeah, this is a fantastic way to just kind of allow for a bit more vertical variety in the soundscape. And yeah, like I said, it can be applied to music as well. I just wanted to show an example with sound effects, or voice lines in this case, because it's really helpful. All right, and now I don't know why I went to the assets window, but now for the music, I think it's this one. I know it's this one first. Okay, so I'm just gonna go from linear, like the extreme linear side, to my current extreme for the adaptive side. So what we got here is the piece that kind of opens the game. So when you turn on the game, it'll play this. I'm gonna see if I can like turn down the volume because it's probably gonna be loud. Oh god, the music. Okay, so I don't know where to turn down the volume in FMOD. Yay. But anyways, what I did is I just made the linear piece, and then once it reaches the end, it goes into this loop, which is literally just a synth. Just a really, really low bass. And it just keeps looping on itself. So that's one use of a one-shot, and that's a use of a linear loop in stupidly basic form. But as you can see here, the loop has a condition right here, level clear 0. So when the level clear is still at 0, which I use to track whether or not the player entered the game, as long as it's still at 0, it keeps looping. So when I set it to 1 and it hits one of the flags, it really badly cuts off to the end right there. And yeah, that's a use of horizontally changing it. So we'll get into a bit more of that with this piece, which is one of the 2 combat tracks I actually finished for the game. So basically what happens is I start it up. There's no loop at the beginning. Oh my god, this is bringing back memories. But basically it starts up the intro, it plays that part once, and then in the loop, it plays the loop as long as you're not in combat. And then when the enter combat parameter hits 1, and it hits this flag, it plays the transition. I wasn't sure how loud it is, so I'm just gonna pause it when I do this. But it keeps looping until the in combat tag is hit to 1, and then once it hits 1, it plays the transition piece, which once again is a one shot, and then that immediately leads into the combat loop, which it's in the name, it loops. And like the other, as long as the level clear is set to 0, then it won't go to the end piece. But when it hits 0, or let's say you beat the level, then it skips to the end. And as you might have noticed, I also have this here, the is paused, which basically just really dampens the audio. And there you just saw that I left level clear at 1, so it just jumps to the end. And now to kind of cap all this off, the most complex thing I've done with this kind of loop is right here, which is a lot more impressive than it looks more impressive than it actually is, trust me. It's really not complicated at all. It's kind of poorly done. But anyways, it's exactly the same principle as this, except instead of just horizontal, because this is horizontal resequencing, I added a bit more vertical layering to it. So as you can see here, I've got the evil synth loop that was featured here. I've got that playing all throughout the non-combat piece, as well as throughout the combat piece. And then I also have a melodic, the melody playing on the synth during the non-combat piece. So I'm just going to start it up and hope that it's not extremely loud. And right here, here's a bit of the use of the dynamics that I was talking about. And you can also add a panning effect, which I did, just to give it a bit more weird, spacey vibes. So now we've entered the loop. I just used that in the intro. I could have probably used it in the loop to offer it a bit more variety. And you're probably noticing as well, there's a lot of flags up here. This was basically just done so that any bar I could transition into the combat loop. And I forgot how badly that was done. Yeah, and then it goes straight into the combat loop, which, same thing, it has flags every chance it has. And hitting level clear, it sends it to the end of the track. So, with those uh, very, very aged pieces, I hope that helped to kind of explain how you can use not just horizontal resequencing to jump from one part to another, but also vertical mixing so that you can apply different parts in different areas, like how those harmonies that just played at the end, um, how they can be used. Like I could put it anywhere really, and that kind of variability just isn't available in something like this where it's all just mixed in one piece. Um, yeah, so hopefully that helped. I'm going to jump back to the presentation now. And where the hell is it? There we go. And there we go. OBS. Cool, cool, cool. All right, and that went on 16 minutes longer than I thought. So thank you for sticking around. Yeah, I hope you learned something. Like I said, next week is the workshop session, and yeah, we'll be able to just kind of play each other's sounds for each other, give each other some feedback. Hopefully learn a few things from each other if we need to, if we want to. And yeah, really appreciate it.